Hey, have you ever accidentally created a cinematic universe? I mean, I sure haven't, but a random possession movie did way back in 2013. This movie took 14 years to get funded, it was made on a budget, so its overnight success blew everyone's minds who was involved in making it. But New Line saw the potential goldmine on their hands, so they not only greenlit a sequel, they also put another team on a spinoff. The spinoff doubled the franchise's total profits and the sequel tripled them, so they looked at this situation and said, oh crap, I think we created a cinematic universe. They jumped right in. Of course, they greenlit a third mainline movie, but they also greenlit some spin-offs from the second movie and sequels to the original spin-offs. The point is, they were pushing out movies in this universe left and right. And for a while, it 100% worked. Critics were kind of mixed on the sequels and spin-offs, but audiences were hooked, they kept coming back, and these things were making tons of money. But over time, the people at the top just stopped caring. They set their sights firmly on building out a big superhero universe to counter the MCU. The amazing practical effects that the series was known for turned into cheap digital ones. The stories got pretty dang lazy, and now 12 years later, the whole thing is just limping over the finish line. The franchise I'm talking about is The Conjuring, and even though it had its ups and downs over the past 12 years, it is definitely bittersweet that it's all coming to an end. But looking at the bigger picture, I think this is a sign that audiences are finally ready to close the book on big interconnected cinematic universes altogether. So in today's video, I'm going to document the accidental meteoric rise of The Conjuring and its weirdly long-winded fall. This is gonna sound crazy, but The Conjuring almost didn't happen. It all started with a producer named Tony DeRosa Grund, who had a great idea, a blueprint for a movie, and a title. He shopped it around Hollywood for 14 years and was met with the classic brutality of boardrooms. Basically, the big studios kept telling him hit the bricks, and the indie studios he made deals with would always fall through. But finally, after years of rejection, he brought it to New Line and they bit. And it was a pretty good deal. They gave him a $20 million budget, they hired the Hayes brothers to turn his idea into a script, and they even hired James Wan to direct it. Wan gets most of the credit for The Conjuring's success, and rightfully so. I mean, his direction is incredible, his camera work is what really elevated it, but the Hayes brothers also deserve a lot of credit for some very crucial decisions they made when they were writing the movie. The first big one was that instead of focusing on the Perron family, like, you know, A Haunting in Connecticut or the Amityville Horror, they flipped the script and made the Warrens the main characters. It seems like a small change on paper, but it stopped this movie from feeling derivative of those other movies I just mentioned, and it caused this movie to become the anchor of a cinematic universe, so it is a pretty big deal. They also pushed against the mean-spirited trend of other possession movies where the exorcists come in and get humiliated and defeated, and they said, what if family and faith are enough to defeat evil? But going back to James Wan, he actually got the directing job for this movie completely by accident. There are a lot of happy accidents with this movie. He was already a fan of the Warrens' work, so he called up his agent and said, hey, is anyone working on a movie about these people? And his agent was like, yeah, New Line just started production on a brand new movie. So his agent called up New Line and bam, they hired him. He was the perfect fit for this franchise because he was just coming off the huge success of Saw and Insidious. And the timing on all this was also weirdly perfect because by 2011, people were starting to get burned out on 80s remakes and found footage movies. So maybe it was another happy accident that this movie took 14 years to sell. Filming also went super smooth on this movie. The Warrens came and visited the set, and after hearing that they had a weird contract about what could or couldn't be in the movie, I'm honestly surprised that they were stoked about how they were being portrayed. They were like, this is perfect, keep going. And Wan made a crucial choice and decided to challenge himself. He said, hey, this movie takes place in the 1970s, so why don't I only try to create practical effects that could have been done in the 70s? And that turned out to be another great choice because by that point, horror had almost completely moved on to crappy digital effects and fans hated it. There were little blips of backlash throughout the early 2010s, but everything came to a head in 2011 when The Thing came out, and they went through all that effort to create amazing practical effects, and then the studio paid to have it done over with CGI effects that looked terrible. So Wan's choice to go fully practical made using techniques from the past feel fresh and inspired again. It was just perfect timing. And even though this movie was quote unquote a true story, it didn't shackle itself to the Warrens' reality. It focused on getting the story and characters right first and foremost, so it had a beating heart thanks to the parents' family bond and of course Ed and Lorraine Warren's amazing marriage. For example, building so many of the early scares around games like hide and seek makes you care about the family once the hauntings start to kick off. So while the Hollywood executives looked at this whole thing like, whoa, that movie was successful? It's hard to imagine a reality where The Conjuring didn't clean up. And boy, did it absolutely clean up. Even though it was flanked from both directions by The Purge and The Wolverine, it absolutely dominated the box office on its opening weekend. New Line was hoping it would make $25 million, but it blew their expectations out of the water and pulled in over $42 million. And it was that rare perfect storm of a horror movie that both critics and audiences love, so weekend after weekend, people kept showing up to see it. It ended up making an absolutely insane $320 million, which is like 16 times its budget. Needless to say, at that point, New Line knew they had a goldmine of a franchise on their hands, so they grabbed a shovel and started digging. First off, they knew they had to greenlight a sequel for James Wan. That was a no-brainer, but they also caught on to the fact that during test screenings and opening weekend reactions that people actually really liked the intro to the movie that featured the creepy doll Annabelle, so they were like, what if we also greenlight a spin-off featuring that doll? Outside of the elevator sequence, which ironically is the only scene in the movie that James Wan directed, Annabelle turned out to be pretty mediocre, but it didn't matter. The audiences still showed up and it doubled the profits of the first Conjuring movie. That told New Line two things. First of all, audiences were hooked on the Conjuring universe, and second, they didn't really even have to make good movies to keep them coming back. But again, timing was everything, so when they released The Conjuring 2 in 2016, they weren't totally sold on the franchise just yet, but it proved that audiences were still hooked, and that's probably because Wan's sequel is bigger and better than the first movie in every single way. The Warrens' faith came in clutch in fighting an even scarier demon, and it turns out even though they're European, the Hodgson family was just as easy to root for as the parents were in the first movie. On the filmmaking side, he looked at the first movie and said, what if we turned everything up? So the demon this time around gets a face through Bonnie Aaron's. Valak was amazing. He delivered one of the scariest scenes I've ever seen in a movie with that character, where Vera Farmiga's looking at a painting of Valak and then she comes to life and runs towards the camera. That one is awesome. I also thought the whole idea of giving Lorraine a premonition of Ed's death was a great way to raise the stakes, because she wants to help these people, but if she does, she's scared her husband might die. The shot when Ed is hanging out the window is also masterful, and it reminds me of Evil Dead, even though it's not a direct callback. It just has that energy. Critics loved it, audiences loved it, I loved it, and weirdly, it ended up almost making the same amount of money as the first movie, which tripled the overall gross of the franchise. So if New Line was still on the fence about the whole cinematic universe thing after The Conjuring and Annabelle, there's no way they were unsure now. They went full MCU and greenlit every idea they could think of. Annabelle Creation came out next, and they gave that one to David F. Sandberg, who had just made them a ton of money with Lights Out, and it turns out he was exactly what the Annabelle franchise needed, because Annabelle Creation is so good compared to the first movie that they feel like they're from different franchises. That movie is full of great scare scenes, but the one that always stood out to me is when the scarecrow is hanging on the wall and you literally see him fill in. After that came another no-brainer, The Nun. I mean, Valak was so cool, you had to give her own movie. I bought into the hype after visiting the set in Romania, but then when it actually came out, I was like, whoa, this is not a good movie at all. They really played up the fact in the marketing that it was shot on location in Romania, but they shot 90% of it indoors on a soundstage, and it just like didn't live up to that hype. But again, the quality didn't matter to audiences. They showed up and made it a huge hit.
That's a hit.
That era was undeniably the peak of the Conjuring universe, because it made enough money to not only beat Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street's profits, but it also became the highest grossing horror franchise of all time. The only thing stopping Real Ones from hitting its peak is the lame YouTube algorithm, but you can help me fight against it by hyping this video. It's below the video if you're watching on your phone, and it actually helps get videos out there from new creators like me. Anyway, after all that success, New Line was definitely confident. They had every right to be, but this is the point where they started getting cocky, and that's always a bad move. It's definitely after Annabelle Creation where the cracks really started to show. The first huge disaster in the Conjuring universe was The Curse of La Llorona. New Line hired a newcomer named Michael Chavez to direct it as his first big feature film, and it had two major problems right out of the gate. First of all, New Line could not decide whether or not this movie was even a Conjuring universe movie in the first place. It brought back Father Perez from Annabelle, so technically it's connected, but it gave them enough plausible deniability in case it sucked, and it kind of sucked. And that's the second big issue. It didn't really bring anything new to the table. It pulled a lot from Insidious, it pulled a lot from all the other Conjuring movies, and even the scares just felt like a greatest hits CD version of everything you've already seen. I was and still am a huge fan of this universe, but that movie is the only one I saw as a cheap cash in on the brand. It really just felt like they were losing the plot a little bit with this whole universe thing. To be fair to New Line, they bounced back pretty quick with Annabelle Comes Home. They gave this one to Gary Doberman, who had writing credits all over New Line Cinema movies. And also, I thought it was a great choice to focus on Judy as the main character, the Warrens' daughter, and recasting her as McKenna Grace was a god tier move. First of all, it was set on Halloween and they decorated it appropriately, so you know I was there day one regardless, but I also loved that it felt like a Goosebumps book come to life. I mean, it took place in the Warrens' occult museum and it focused on all their trinkets coming to life. It was just so cool. I mean, come on, a ghost werewolf? Where have you ever seen one of those before? The Ferryman? I wish he got his own spinoff because he was sick. And that hard work definitely paid off because it did better at the box office than La Llorona, but it still wasn't reaching the heights of previous Conjuring movies, so the cracks really were starting to show at this point. And that brought us to The Conjuring 3, which they retitled The Conjuring: The Devil Made Me Do It, which is just a terrible title. Leading into it, New Line found themselves in a weird spot, definitely of their own making. For the past few years, they had used the Conjuring franchise as a training camp for DCEU directors, so James Wan got promoted to Aquaman and David F. Sandberg got promoted to Shazam, so they didn't really have anyone to direct the third Conjuring movie. But for some reason, instead of just letting Gary Doberman direct it, they brought back Michael Chavez, and it ended up being a huge mistake. The story was more grounded than the first two movies because it focused on a famous court case where the Warrens had to defend a guy who was saying that he was possessed when he killed someone. It was a cool idea, I guess, because, you know, the Warrens were still there to keep the franchise's heart intact, but focusing on a guy who's defending himself against a murderer is a weird choice when the first two movies focused on an innocent family. The scares also took a huge hit. There was more digital work than ever before. The scares themselves were kind of by the numbers, and I guess that's fine for a spin-off movie, but for a mainline Conjuring movie, that stuff just doesn't fly. It was still profitable, which is good, I guess, but people forgot about it within a week, so, you know, the magic that kept people coming back to the theater was definitely evaporating. Then in 2023, they just threw out The Nun to Die, and by that point, the momentum was gone, and the whole thing just started to feel like it was running on fumes. The novelty had long since worn off, the directing chops just weren't there on the mainline entries, and people just weren't coming back in the same way that they did before. Ironically though, this franchise was nowhere near alone in its slump. Both the DCEU and the MCU were struggling at the exact same time. That's right about when it looked like the cinematic universe bubble was ready to pop. Every franchise has to come to an end at some point, and all of them should. But for a while there, it really seemed like the Conjuring universe, the DC universe, and the MCU had figured out this golden formula to make them last decades longer than they ever had in the past with the same continuity. But studios can never handle a good thing, so when box offices started to dip, instead of taking a step back, regrouping, and bringing the bar back up where it was, they greenlight so many more movies and just throw them out there and panic, and it never really works out. Money gets spread even thinner, visual effects artists are worked to the bone, the quality just drops even lower than it was when people stopped showing up in the first place. It happened with Marvel, it happened with DC, it happened with The Conjuring, it happened with all of the cinematic universes. But the big difference between the superhero stuff and The Conjuring is that the superhero stuff needs to make $1 billion every single time, but The Conjuring definitely doesn't. If they weren't so focused on chasing the MCU's tail to make billions of dollars, they could have continued to make hundreds of millions on The Conjuring if they just worked to keep the quality bar at a consistent level. Instead of using it as a farm league for the DC universe, they should have kept James Wan around for more sequels, they should have kept David F. Sandberg around for more spin-off sequels, and they should have given the spin-offs to new directors to help shepherd them into the universe. They also proved by themselves that you cannot force a cinematic universe to work. Universal learned that the hard way with their whole dark universe thing, but after taking a few L's with the DC universe, they should have just put their money where it was working, and I still can't believe they didn't. And that brings us right into the bittersweet part. Even though The Conjuring fizzled out towards the end, I've never felt like it gets the credit it deserves. As much as the horror critic world loves to hate on this franchise for its happy endings, its use of jump scares, and the fact that it won't scathingly criticize religion at every turn possible, it wasn't just another horror franchise. It was the only cinematic universe outside of the MCU that truly organically worked. It had a legendary $2 billion box office run, a bunch of movies that totally stand on their own and can be watched without watching everything in order, and a bunch of iconic villains that people are definitely going to be nostalgic for in years to come. If New Line and WB had actually given it the attention it deserved instead of tossing it scraps while they throw billions at the disaster that is the DCEU, things 100% would have been different, but they aren't. And at this point, everyone involved with its creation, like Vera Farmiga, Patrick Wilson, James Wan, and everyone else seem ready ready to move on, and honestly, I think it might be time. I guess that's just what happens when you're dealing with horror, and keeping that in mind, it's actually kind of incredible that things kept going as great as they did for as long as they did. With Last Rites, the Conjuring universe is finally coming to a close, and the timing could not be more clear. Marvel is struggling, DC is in their nth reboot, and Dark Universe doesn't exist anymore. That might be its own video, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. At the end of the day, I'm not only thankful that this franchise is getting a true finale, I'm also thankful that it existed at all in the first place. Horror has been stuck in the mental gutter for what feels like over a decade at this point. Lately, it's really been about letting evil win, glorifying trauma, and making us sympathize with villains that they think are way more ambiguous about how evil they are than they actually are. The Conjuring movies were great because they were an antidote to the constant negativity. Year after year, movie after movie, they kept me coming back, and I always left the theater with a smile on my face. So I hope James Wan takes a break from producing soon and gets back into the director's chair, because I definitely miss his work. So the last question to answer when it comes to The Conjuring is, does it limp across the finish line, or does it have a triumphant finale? I'll let you know after I see it. Anyway guys, that brings me to the end of this video. Thank you so much for the support on the weapons video. It blows my mind how much people enjoyed that video, and man, it just means a lot. So thank you so much. If you're a free follower of the Patreon, you might have noticed that I started using it like a blog to put cool trailers in front of your eyes and let you know what I'm excited for. And I also have been putting up polls to gauge interest for future videos. If you're still watching at the end of the video, why haven't you subscribed already? Please check out the Patreon, and if you subscribe to it for $4 a month, I will be eternally grateful. I'm excited to get into the Halloween season, and I hope you are too. Anyway guys, as always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.